The first scream ripped through the throne hall before the court musicians could finish their song. A silver tray crashed across black marble. Blood-red wine splashed over the hem of a servant woman's dress as two noblewomen shoved her to her knees in front of everyone. "Lazy little rat," Lady Seraphine snapped, loud enough for the whole court to hear. "Your child dares to replace you, and now you can't even stand." Laughter spread through the hall like poison. Vivian Solon, pale and shaking, tried to push herself upright, but another cough bent her in half. Dark liquid stained her hand. At the center of the room, 6-year-old Arya clutched a basket of folded linens to her chest and stared in horror as the nobles circled her mother like wolves. The girl had only come to beg forgiveness for missing work. Instead, she had walked straight into public humiliation. Then the throne doors opened, and every voice died. Lord Cale Raventhorn, the Vampire King, stepped into the hall wearing black silk and cold fury. His crimson eyes swept over the crowd, over the laughing nobles, over the servant woman choking on the floor, and finally landed on the little girl trembling beside her. Arya looked up at him with tear-filled blue eyes and whispered the words that shattered the room. "Please don't let them hurt my mommy." The silence that followed felt alive, heavy, dangerous. Cale descended the steps of the throne dais with the calm of a predator seconds before violence. "Who," he asked softly, "gave permission for this spectacle?" No one answered. Nobody wanted to be the first to speak. Seraphine lifted her chin anyway because cruel people often mistake safety for power. "Your Majesty," the servant failed her duty again, and then her child arrived in her place as though the castle were some marketplace. "We were simply reminding them that rules still exist." Arya flinched as Vivian coughed harder. The basket slipped from the girl's hands. Fresh linen spilled over the wine-soaked floor. "She's sick," Arya cried, voice shaking but loud enough to carry. "She tried to get up. She really tried. I came because she couldn't breathe." A few nobles smirked at the child's desperation. One old lord muttered, "Pathetic." Cale heard it. Everyone knew he heard it. His face did not change, but the candelabras along the walls flared violently, and the room temperature dropped so fast that breath turned white in the air. He stopped in front of Vivian, looked down at the black stain on her trembling hand, and then turned his gaze to the entire court. "Anyone who laughs again," he said, "will leave this hall without a tongue." That ended the laughter. Guards rushed forward at a single glance from him. Vivian was lifted carefully from the floor. Arya tried to follow, but Seraphine's jeweled cane struck the ground in front of her. "The child does not belong in the royal infirmary," she said coldly. "She is a servant's burden, not a lady." Arya froze. Cale turned his head slowly, and Seraphine made the mistake of holding his gaze. "Say that again," he said. She smiled, but it was thinner now. "I said she is not," she never finished. Cale moved so fast half the room gasped. One moment he stood 3 steps away, the next his hand was around Seraphine's throat, pinning her against a pillar. Cracks spidered through the stone behind her. "This child," he said in a low, lethal voice, "is under my protection from this moment forward. Test that once more and I will decorate the gate with your bones." He released her. Seraphine crumpled to the floor, choking on fear instead of arrogance for the first time in decades. Cale looked at Arya. His voice changed completely. "Come here." She did, tiny boots slipping over polished marble, and he lifted her into his arms as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The court stared. A vampire king holding a mortal child in front of the whole realm should have looked unnatural. Instead, it looked terrifyingly right. By the time they reached the infirmary, the healers were already panicking. Vivian convulsed on a narrow bed while dark veins crawled slowly up her throat. Arya buried her face in Cale's shoulder, but she could still hear everything. "It's spreading too fast. This isn't a normal fever. Who brought her in? How did this happen?" Cale placed Arya in a chair near the bed and stepped toward the physicians. "Speak clearly," he ordered. "What is killing her?" The oldest healer swallowed. "My lord. This is night rot." Even the room seemed to recoil from the words. Cale's eyes narrowed. Night rot was not an illness that simply appeared. It was made, poisoned, planted. Vivian's fingers clawed weakly at the blanket. "Arya," she whispered. The child ran to her mother instantly. "I'm here, Mommy, I'm here." Vivian touched her daughter's cheek with a shaking hand and tried to smile through the pain. You shouldn't have come. I told you never to come alone. Arya was crying now, properly crying, all the bravery breaking apart at once. I didn't want them to throw us out. I wanted to help. Vivian closed her eyes like the words hurt worse than the poison. Cale stood beside the bed, watching the two of them, and something old and locked away shifted inside him. He had spent a century ruling with order, distance, and fear. But he had not planned for a 6-year-old girl willing to walk into a fortress of monsters just to keep her mother employed. He ordered everyone else out. When the room emptied, he crouched before Arya so they were eye level. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Your mother is very sick, but no one will throw you out. No one will touch either of you. Do you understand?" Arya's lips trembled. "You promise." He looked at the little hand gripping Vivian's blanket, then at the dark poison creeping through the woman's body. "Yes," he said. "I promise." She studied him the way frightened children study adults when deciding whether hope is safe. Then she nodded once. That should not have mattered to him, but it did, more than it should have. He rose and crossed to the far wall where Celeste, his sharp-eyed head steward, waited in silence. "Seal the infirmary. No council member enters. Double guards on every corridor. Bring me a list of every person who handled Vivian's food, water, laundry, or work assignments in the last month." Celeste blinked. "You think this was deliberate?" Cale turned to look at Vivian again. "I know it was." Celeste hesitated only a second before bowing and leaving at once. That night the fortress changed around Arya. Servants whispered as she passed. The runes in the old stone glowed faintly when she got too close, as if the castle itself were looking at her. She didn't notice at first. She was too focused on carrying warm cloths to the infirmary and sitting beside her mother's bed, humming under her breath the way Vivian used to hum when Arya was sick. But Cale noticed everything. He noticed the flicker of ward light following her tiny footsteps. He noticed the chandeliers brightening when she entered a room. He noticed ancient doors unlatching a heartbeat before she reached them. Once, while she sat asleep in a chair beside Vivian's bed, one of the carved wolves at the foot of the royal staircase lowered its stone head toward her as though bowing. That should have been impossible. The castle's founding magic responded only to the original bloodline tied to Raventhorn Keep. That bloodline had died 100 years ago with one mortal woman and the scandal that nearly destroyed his throne. At least that was what he had been told. At least that was the lie he had been fed. The next morning he summoned Celeste to his study. "Tell me everything about Vivian Solon." The steward folded her hands. "She arrived 7 years ago with an infant and no references. She asked for work in the laundry. She never caused trouble, never joined gossip, never accepted court favors. She works, returns to her quarters, and keeps to herself. Family? None nearby. She claims they cast her out." "Enemies?" Celeste gave a humorless little smile. "My lord, a poor woman in a fortress full of nobles has enemies by default." Cale's expression did not change. "Start nomming them." Celeste exhaled slowly. "Lady Seraphine dislikes her because Vivian once refused to lie for her. Lord Varys resents her because she slapped his hand away when he cornered her in the West Hall 2 years ago. Elder Thorne watches too much and asks too little." Cale filed each name away with cold precision. "And the child?" Celeste's eyes softened slightly despite herself. "Everyone says she is unusually brave." Cale looked toward the window where dawn was staining the sky violet. "That is not what I asked." Celeste hesitated. "Some of the kitchen girls say the castle likes her." He said nothing. He did not need to. Both of them knew how impossible that sounded. When Arya finally left the infirmary that afternoon, it was only because one of the younger healers coaxed her into eating. She sat at a small table in Cale's private study with a plate of buttered bread and fruit she barely touched. Cale was reading reports across from her, but every few minutes he found his eyes lifting from the page to her face. She looked too small in such a large room, too serious for someone her age. At last she asked, "Are kings always this quiet?" It caught him off guard. "Usually." She considered that. "Then maybe kings are lonely." He looked at her fully now. No one spoke to him this way. Nobles used polished lies, servants used fear, enemies used strategy. Only children ever used truth without armor. "And what would you know about lonely?" he asked. Arya tore a piece of bread in half. "A lot." The answer landed harder than he expected. She kept talking because children often do when nobody has yet taught them to hide pain. Mommy says lonely is when you stop expecting footsteps outside the door. I used to ask if anyone would come for us. She stopped answering after a while. Kale's hand tightened on the parchment. Who was supposed to come? Arya shrugged. I don't know. Someone important, maybe. Mommy cries when she thinks I'm asleep. He said nothing after that because silence was safer than admitting the strange pressure building in his chest. That evening the first real attack came, not with knives but with smiles. A formal dinner had been arranged by the council under the excuse of discussing border matters. Kale arrived late on purpose and found the conversation already circling its target. Lady Seraphine sat beside Elder Thorn in a gown the color of old blood, pretending elegance while poison dripped from every word. We understand your Majesty's compassion, she was saying, but there are appearances to consider. A servant woman in the royal infirmary, a human child wandering private halls, it sends the wrong message. Kale took his seat at the head of the long obsidian table. And what message would you prefer? Seraphine smiled carefully. That laws still matter, Lord Varys added, that mortals know their place. Kale rested one hand on the arm of his chair. Interesting, because from where I stand, the only ones forgetting their place are seated at this table. A few counselors looked down immediately. Thorn did not. He leaned forward, ancient fingers steepled. Night rot in a servant is unfortunate, but not unusual in lower districts. Lie to someone younger, Kale said. Night rot requires deliberate corruption. Thorn's eyes flickered once. That was enough. Kale saw it, stored it, fed it to the growing certainty already burning in him. Then Seraphine said the wrong thing. Whatever the cause, the woman is not worth unrest. If she dies, the child can be placed somewhere discreet. Kale's chair scraped against stone as he stood. The goblets on the table vibrated. If any of you speak of disposing of that child again, he said, I will stop behaving like a king and start behaving like a man who has lost patience. No one at the table mistook the threat. Later that night, Arya got lost, or at least that was what she thought. In truth, the castle was guiding her. She had gone looking for hot water for her mother and taken a wrong turn beyond the servant halls. The corridors here were older, colder, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed almost awake in the candlelight. At the end of one hall stood a black door carved with silver vines and crescent moons. Arya paused. The runes around the frame glowed the instant she stepped closer. The door opened on its own. Inside waited a sealed chamber untouched by time. Dust floated through pale moonlight. Shelves of old books lined the walls. At the far end hung a portrait of a woman with golden hair, blue eyes, and a face so painfully familiar Arya forgot to breathe. You should not be here, Kale said from behind her. She spun. He stood in the doorway, still as shadow. I'm sorry, she whispered. I was looking for the kitchen. But Kale was not looking at her apology. He was looking at the portrait and then at her and then back again. The resemblance was no longer a suspicion. It was a wound reopening. Arya pointed at the painting. She looks like me. Kale's jaw tightened. Yes. Who is she? He crossed the room slowly, every step heavy with memory. Someone the council told me was dead. Arya looked up at him. Did you love her? For a second the immortal king looked almost human. More than anything. She should have been afraid then, standing in a forbidden room with a predator king and the ghost of his past staring down from the wall. But children recognize sadness even when wrapped in power. Did she leave? Arya asked softly. Kale's eyes never left the portrait. No, she was taken. The room went still. Even the dust seemed to hang in place. Arya stepped closer to the painting. She has my eyes, yes, and my hair, yes. Then maybe she wasn't all gone. The words were simple, childish. And they struck him harder than any accusation the council could make. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Fast, urgent. Celeste burst into the room, breathing hard. My lord, come now, it's Vivian. Arya ran before anyone could stop her. The infirmary was chaos again, worse than before. Healers shouted over one another while black veins raced over Vivian's skin like living ink. The poison was no longer creeping, it was devouring. Arya climbed onto the bed and grabbed her mother's hand with both of hers. Mommy, wake up, Mommy, please. Vivian's eyes opened only halfway, but panic flared the moment she saw Kale. No, she rasped. Not here, not in front of her. He moved to the bedside. You are out of time, he said. Tell me the truth now or you die with it. Vivian started coughing so violently the healer beside her recoiled. Thick black fluid stained the sheet. Arya cried out. Cale did not soften his voice. He could not afford to. Who are you hiding from? Vivian looked at her daughter, then at the door, then finally at him. Not who, she whispered. What? Her eyes filled with tears. A bloodline. The room seemed to narrow around those words. Speak plainly, Cale ordered. Vivian shook her head weakly. Years ago. I helped a woman escape through the servant tunnels. She was pregnant. She said if they caught her, they would kill the baby too. Cale went still, utterly still. What was her name? Vivian's lips trembled. Liriana. Arya looked between them, confused, frightened, not understanding why the entire room had just changed. Cale's face lost all color. For a heartbeat, he stopped looking like an immortal king and started looking like a man being stabbed by memory. Vivian forced the rest out between ragged breaths. She begged me to hide her. I gave her clothes, money, directions beyond the lower city. I thought that was the end. But years later, before she died, she found me. Cale gripped the edge of the bed so hard the wood cracked. No, Vivian nodded, crying openly now. She had a daughter, your daughter, and when she knew she would not survive, she made me swear to protect the child's line if it ever came under threat. Arya's small hand tightened around her mother's fingers. Mommy, what is she saying? But neither adult could answer her yet. Vivian looked at Cale with fever-bright eyes full of horror and truth. Arya isn't just some servant's child, she whispered. She is Liriana's blood, your blood. That is why the castle knows her. That is why they poisoned me. They were never trying to kill only me. They were trying to reach her. That was the moment everything flipped. Not later. Not when the council learned it, not when the castle roared awake, here, in that narrow room with a dying woman, a sobbing child, and a king whose world had just been torn open after a century of lies. Cale turned slowly toward Arya. She stared back at him with tear-wet eyes and Liriana's face in miniature, his family, his blood, his last living piece of the woman they had stolen from him. Something monstrous woke beneath his skin, not hunger. Not rage alone, judgment. He looked at Vivian again. Who knows, she swallowed hard. Thorn, Seraphine, Varys, maybe others. I heard them talking outside the washroom 2 weeks ago. They said the bloodline should have ended generations ago. They said if the child ever reached the castle, the old laws would break. Cale straightened with terrifying calm. Celeste. Yes, my lord. Seal every gate. Nobody enters. Nobody leaves. Send guards for Seraphine, Varys, and Elder Thorn. If they resist, break them. Arya looked up at him, terrified by the sudden violence in the room. He knelt before her again despite the storm in his veins. Listen to me, he said, and this time his voice shook with something deeper than anger. You will stay beside me now, always. Do you understand? She nodded slowly. Are they bad people? His eyes lifted toward the shadows beyond the infirmary door. Yes, he said, and they have been bad for a very long time. Vivian cried out as another wave of poison tore through her. The healers rushed forward, but one look at their faces told Cale the truth. Minutes, maybe less. Arya threw herself over her mother, sobbing openly now. Don't go, Mommy, please don't go. Vivian used the last of her strength to touch her daughter's hair. Little bird, be brave. Then she looked at Cale with the last desperate hope of a dying mother. Promise me, she whispered. Not as king, as him. Promise me you won't let them make her small. The words hit him harder than any oath demanded by law. He bent his head once. I swear. Vivian closed her eyes, but before unconsciousness fully took her, she breathed one more broken sentence. Then take her where the old magic sleeps. Cale's gaze sharpened. He understood immediately. There was only one place in the fortress older than council law. One place untouched by the lies built after Liriana vanished. He scooped Arya into one arm, lifted Vivian with the other, and turned toward the door. My lord, a healer stammered. Where are you taking her? Cale did not slow. To the only part of this castle that still remembers the truth. The forbidden stairway opened behind the portrait chamber with a sound like stone waking from a nightmare. Cale moved fast, one arm carrying Vivian's dying body, the other locking Arya against his chest while Celeste and 2 guards struggled to keep up. The air grew colder with every step downward. Ancient runes burned along the walls in strips of violet fire, recognizing him, then flaring brighter when Arya's little hand pressed against his coat. "It's scared down here," she whispered into his shoulder. "No," Kale said, his voice hard and low. "It's angry." At the bottom of the stair waited a circular chamber no servant, no noble, no council elder had entered in over a century. Black water circled the room in a narrow trench. Silver symbols covered the floor. In the center stood an obsidian altar carved with the crest of House Raventhorn before the council had twisted its laws into chains. This was where the first king swore blood oaths. This was where magic chose family before politics tried to rename it sin. Kale laid Vivian on the altar as carefully as though she were made of glass. Her breathing was almost gone. Dark poison pulsed beneath her skin in time with the runes on the floor. Arya slipped from his arms and ran to the stone slab. "Mommy," she cried. "Mommy, wake up." Vivian's eyes fluttered, but the only answer was a weak, choking gasp. Celeste stared at the altar, face drained white. "My lord," she said, voice unsteady, "you cannot mean to use this place." Kale cut his palm with one fingernail and let blood drip onto the stone. The runes exploded with light. "I mean to save her." Celeste took one step forward. "Blood restoration is forbidden. If the council finds out—" "The council," Kale snapped, "has spent 100 years murdering the innocent and calling it order." His blood kept falling, bright crimson against black stone. The symbols beneath Vivian's body blazed harder, and the poison running through her veins reacted instantly. It writhed, literally writhed. Arya screamed and tried to grab her mother's hand, but Kale caught the child's wrist before the magic could burn her. "Stay back." She looked up at him with wet, furious eyes. "You said you would save her. I am trying." "Then why does it look like it hurts?" "Because real saving always hurts," he nearly said. "Because power never comes without cost. Because he had already guessed this ritual would take from him as much as it gave. But Arya was 6, and 6-year-olds did not deserve immortal truths delivered like knives. So he crouched and held her face between his hands for one fierce second. "Look at me. Whatever happens next, you do not let go of hope. Do you understand?" She was crying too hard to speak, but she nodded. He rose, lifted his bleeding hand over the altar, and began chanting in the old language. Chamber answered. Wind tore through the underground room, though no doors were open. The black water around the altar rippled violently. Every rune on the floor lit in sequence, forming a circle of living fire around Vivian's body. Kale felt the ritual seize him instantly, not like a tool he controlled, but like a beast deciding whether he was worthy to survive it. Ancient power ripped through his veins, dragging old memories with it. Liriana laughing in torchlight. Liriana bleeding in the servant tunnel. Liriana's hand slipping from his. He nearly staggered but forced the words out anyway. On the altar, Vivian arched in agony as the night rot fought back. Thick black smoke poured from her mouth. Arya shrank against Celeste, trembling, but she never took her eyes off her mother. "Make it stop," she whispered. Celeste had no answer. None of them did. The ritual reached deeper. Kale's skin turned pale as winter bone. His heartbeat, which normally lay buried beneath centuries of undeath, slammed once against his ribs so hard it made him gasp. Then again. Then again. The chamber seemed to realize what he was paying and glowed brighter with savage hunger. It was not just feeding on blood. It was feeding on immortality itself. Above them, in the fortress proper, the council struck back. Seraphine and Varys were already gone from their chambers by the time guards arrived. Elder Thorne never even pretended innocence. He took control of the East Wing, locked down the armory, and began whispering open rebellion before the household could recover from the shock. "The king has lost reason," he told every noble willing to listen. "He hides in old crypts performing forbidden blood rites for a human woman. He has declared a half-blood child sacred. If he is not stopped tonight, the throne itself will belong to mortals by dawn." Fear spread fast in places built on old prejudice. Within an hour, armed loyalists to the council were moving through the fortress in organized lines. Servants were shoved into corners. Doors were sealed. Rumors multiplied faster than facts. Some said Kale had gone mad. Others said the child had bewitched him. By the time Celeste's runners tried to warn the Western Guard, half the castle had already chosen a side. That was what the council understood best. They did not always win by strength. They won by making cowardice sound reasonable. Down below, the ritual snapped to its most dangerous phase. Vivian's blackened veins began shrinking under her skin, but every inch they retreated left Kale weaker. Blood ran freely down his arm now, pattering onto the altar in hot, rhythmic drops. Arya could see him shaking. "You're sick too," she said, panic rising again. He did not answer. He could barely breathe. The ancient language had become knives in his throat. Vivian suddenly jerked upright and screamed. Not a human scream. Something ripped straight from the center of pain. A dark shape burst from her mouth like living tar and hit the floor hissing. Celeste recoiled. One guard crossed himself instinctively. The thing on the stone squirmed like a parasite made of shadow, trying to slither toward the trench water. Kale's eyes flashed. With the last of the chant, he slammed his bloody palm onto the floor. The rune circle collapsed inward. Violet fire caged the parasite, crushed it, and burned it into ash. Then all the light in the room rushed backward at once. Vivian fell still. Kale staggered. The chamber went silent. For one terrible second, nobody moved. Arya stared at her mother's face, too pale, too still. "Mommy," she whispered. No response. She ran to the altar. "Mommy!" Kale took one step toward them and his knees gave out. He crashed to the floor hard enough to crack stone. Celeste rushed to him, but he shoved her away, trying to stand again. He failed. Across the room, Arya's sobs turned wild and broken. "No, no, no, no." She was shaking Vivian's shoulder now with tiny, desperate hands. Then Vivian gasped. Air tore into her lungs like someone drowning breaking the surface. Her whole body convulsed once, twice, and then the black stain faded from her skin as color slowly returned to her face. Arya froze in disbelief. "Mommy!" Vivian's eyes opened. Weak, confused, alive. "Little bird." That was enough. Arya burst into tears so hard she almost collapsed over the altar. She grabbed her mother around the neck and buried her face against her. Vivian held her tightly even through her own exhaustion, whispering the same words again and again. "I'm here, I'm here, I'm here." Celeste let out a shaking breath. One guard dropped to one knee in stunned relief. But at the edge of the circle, Kale was still on the floor and not getting up. Arya looked over her mother's shoulder and saw him. His eyes were half closed. The crimson in them had dimmed to a faint ember. His skin looked colder than the obsidian around him. She slipped from Vivian's arms and hurried to him on unsteady legs. "Your Majesty." Nothing. She touched his sleeve. Kale, still nothing. Panic hit her again, sharper this time because it had no room left to hide. "He won't wake up," she cried. Vivian tried to rise from the altar, nearly falling as she did. Celeste caught her. "Easy." Vivian's eyes were already fixed on the king who had dragged her back from death and now lay broken on the floor because of it. "What did he do?" Celeste's answer came out barely above a whisper. "He gave too much." Arya dropped to her knees beside him and pressed both hands to his cold face. "No," she said fiercely, like refusal itself could change reality. "No, you promised." Tears rolled down her cheeks and fell onto his shirt. "You said nobody would hurt us. You can't sleep now. That's cheating." It was the kind of childish accusation that should have sounded small in a room built for ancient magic. Instead, it tore through every adult there. Vivian pushed free of Celeste and stumbled over. Her body was weak, but a mother who has just gotten her child back does not stay still when another person collapses saving them. She knelt opposite Arya and stared at Kale with dawning horror. "I knew the ritual would cost him," she whispered, "but not this much." Arya looked at her wildly. "Fix it." Vivian's hands trembled. "I don't know how." "Fix it," the girl screamed, and the chamber answered her. The runes all around them flashed at once. Water in the trench climbed the walls like reversed rain. The whole floor shook beneath their knees. Celeste stepped back in alarm. "My lord's bloodline is reacting to her." Vivian stared at Arya, at the child's blazing blue eyes and tiny hands clenched over the king's coat, and understood something terrible and beautiful at the same time. "Arya," she said slowly, "listen to me. Put your hand on his chest." Arya did it instantly. "Now say what you want." The girl looked confused through her tears. "What?" "Say it." Arya pressed harder, voice breaking. "Wake up!" Nothing. Again. "Wake up!" Still nothing. Vivian swallowed and leaned closer. No, not like a command, like the truth. Arya's whole little body shook. Then she bent down until her forehead touched Kale's chest and whispered the only truth she had. "Please don't leave me too." The chamber went still. No wind, no shaking, no fire, just silence. Then a single pulse of light moved from Arya's hand into Kale's body. Once. Soft but undeniable. His chest rose sharply. He coughed, turned his head, and sucked in a ragged breath like a man returning from very far away. Arya jerked upright with a cry that sounded half laugh, half sob, and threw both arms around his neck. This time he did not fall. Weakly, slowly, he lifted one hand and rested it against her back. Celeste looked away for a second because some moments are too intimate even for witnesses. Vivian closed her eyes in pure exhausted relief. Kale opened his fully at last and found Arya clinging to him with all the fierce trust in the world. He should have felt alarm. Instead, he felt something far more dangerous: belonging. When they finally reached the upper chambers again, dawn was still hours away, and the fortress had become a war zone in silk and stone. Celeste had loyal guards stationed outside the western wing, but half the corridors were no longer secure. "Thorn has closed the council hall," she reported, while physicians checked Vivian from a careful distance. "Seraphine is using the household panic against us. They are calling you corrupted. They are saying the child awakened forbidden blood. They want a formal deposition before sunrise." Kale sat in a high-backed chair near the bed, one hand still resting on Arya's shoulder as if some part of him had no intention of letting go again. He looked tired now in a way immortals almost never look tired, but the weakness only made him more frightening. "Then we stop waiting," he said. Vivian looked up from the pillows. "What are you going to do?" Kale's eyes shifted to her. "What I should have done a century ago." Arya, who had refused to leave his side even to sleep, asked the question with childlike seriousness. "Is that a good thing?" He looked down at her. "For us, yes. For the bad people." At that, the faintest shadow of a smile touched his mouth. "No." He ordered the fortress bells rung, not the court bells. The old iron wore bells from the founding tower. Their sound split the pre-dawn darkness like a blade. Every servant woke. Every noble froze. Every guard chose a direction with his next breath. Kale rose, put on a black coat over his still blood-stained shirt, and called for the throne hall to be opened. Celeste moved like lightning from one command to the next. Vivian tried to stand too soon and nearly swayed off the bed, but Kale was at her side before she hit the floor. He caught her by the waist, steadying her with one hand while Arya clutched Vivian's fingers with the other. For half a second the three of them stood there like something impossible made ordinary. A king, a laundress, a child, a family shape the castle had already accepted before the world did. Vivian met his eyes and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "You cannot fight the whole council alone." Kale did not let go of her. "I am not alone anymore." The words landed in the room with more weight than a vow. But the council was already moving their last pieces into place. Before the sun had even touched the eastern towers, Seraphine had every allied house in full ceremonial dress, packing the throne hall with bodies, witnesses, and outrage. Thorn stood at the base of the dais holding a scroll marked with the ancient seal of emergency judgment. Varys wore a triumphant expression that made him uglier than any monster. The story they had built was elegant in its cruelty. The king had gone mad. The mortal woman had seduced him with inherited witch blood. The child was a threat to the realm. If they could get the decree spoken publicly before Kale took control of the room, law itself would become their weapon. And worst of all, they were not entirely wrong about one thing. The child was a threat, just not to the realm, to them, to every rotten law and secret murder and carefully buried lie that kept the old order standing. When the great throne doors finally opened and Kale entered with Vivian at one side and Arya at the other, the entire court inhaled at once. He did not look defeated. He looked like judgment had put on a crown. Seraphine recovered first. She smiled like someone stepping onto a stage she thought she owned. "Your Majesty," she purred, "how wonderful that you came willingly. It saves us the embarrassment of dragging you before your own court." Kale kept walking down the center of the hall. Guards parted. Nobles stepped back. Nobody wanted to be close enough to touch him. "Then by all means," he said coldly, "try to embarrass me." Thorn unrolled the sealed document. By ancient decree, the council accuses Lord Cale Raventhorn of blood corruption, dereliction of immortal law, and unlawful sheltering of mortal threats within the royal keep. Until judgment is passed, the woman Vivian Solon and the child Arya Solon are to be surrendered into council custody. Arya's hand tightened in Cale's instantly. He did not even glance down. "No." The single word cut across the hall like thunder. Thorn's mouth hardened. "You do not refuse procedure. Watch me." Seraphine took one graceful step forward and pointed at Arya as though introducing a criminal. "That child is the proof of your corruption. The castle has been unstable since she arrived. Wards are failing. Runes are answering to mortal blood. The old protections are breaking because she should never have existed." Vivian moved before fear could stop her. She stepped in front of Arya. "Don't point at my daughter," the court gasped. A servant woman speaking over a noble in open hall. Seraphine's eyes gleamed with delighted cruelty. "And there she is, the laundress who thinks a king's weakness is the same thing as mercy." Cale's voice came from behind Vivian, quieter than rage and therefore more dangerous. "Choose your next words with care," Seraphine laughed. "Or what? You will choke another noble for defending the realm. The age of your private grief is over, Cale. This hall does not kneel to dead mortal lovers and their leftover blood." The last sentence echoed. It should not have, but the castle itself seemed to reject it. The chandeliers above the hall burst brighter. Every rune carved into the pillars flared to life. The black floor beneath Arya's shoes began to glow in branching silver patterns that spread outward like roots under ice. Nobles stumbled back. Thorn's voice cracked for the first time. "What has she done?" Cale finally looked down at Arya. She looked terrified. "I didn't mean to." He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and then faced the court again. "That," he said, "is what truth looks like when this castle recognizes it." Silence dropped hard across the hall. Seraphine's confident mask slipped. Thorn took one involuntary step backward. Cale climbed the dais slowly, not to sit, but to stand before the throne as if he no longer needed it to prove anything. "You wanted judgment before sunrise," he said. "Good, you'll have it." He looked out over the nobles who had spent a century feeding on fear and calling it civilization. "Bring every witness. Bring every accusation. Bring every lie you buried with Liriana." His eyes burned now, not only with fury, but with something colder and far more final. "Because before this day ends, one throne will remain standing and one order will burn." The throne hall had never felt this tense in its entire history. Hundreds of vampire nobles stood shoulder to shoulder beneath the towering black pillars of Castle Raventhorn. The silver runes along the walls were glowing brighter than anyone had seen in a century. At the center of the room stood Cale Raventhorn, the vampire king, one hand resting protectively on Arya's shoulder, while Vivian stood on the other side of the child like a shield. Across the hall, Lady Seraphine, Elder Thorn, and Lord Varys looked ready to tear the kingdom apart to keep their power. Seraphine lifted her chin with cold confidence. "You stand accused of breaking the oldest law of our kind," she declared loudly so every noble could hear. "A king who chooses mortals over his own bloodline has already fallen. This council will decide the future of the realm." Murmurs rippled through the court. Some nobles looked uncertain, others furious, but everyone was watching Cale. The king did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. Instead, he stepped forward slowly until he stood between the council and the throne itself. "You speak of law," he said quietly, his voice carrying across the hall with terrifying clarity. "But the only law you have followed for the last 100 years is fear." Thorn slammed his staff against the floor. "Enough, the evidence is clear. The child carries forbidden blood. The castle itself is responding to her. If we allow this to continue, our entire society will collapse." Cale's eyes flicked toward Arya for only a second before returning to the council. "No," he said calmly, "your control will collapse." The words hit the nobles harder than any attack. Seraphine's lips curled into a thin smile. You see, he admits it. The king is no longer ruling for the realm. He rules for a child. Arya looked up at Kale, frightened by the tension and the shouting. Am I doing something bad? She whispered. Kale knelt beside her immediately, ignoring the shocked nobles watching their king drop to one knee in the middle of the throne hall. You did nothing wrong, he said gently. You walked into this castle to help your mother. That is the bravest thing anyone in this room has done in 100 years. Arya nodded slowly, trying to be brave again, but her small fingers tightened around his sleeve. The court saw the moment clearly. The cold king who had ruled them for a century had chosen something over power. Family. Seraphine seized the moment, her voice rising with sharp authority. There it is, the king's weakness. This is exactly why the laws exist. Immortals cannot allow emotions to control the throne. She turned dramatically to the gathered nobles. If we do nothing, every border, every treaty, every rule protecting our kind will crumble. Today it is one human child. Tomorrow it will be an entire generation of them. Some nobles nodded nervously. Others whispered among themselves. Fear was spreading exactly as she wanted. Thorn stepped forward and raised the sealed scroll again. Then we proceed to judgment, he said. Lord Cale Raventhorn, you are hereby removed from the throne until the council decides the fate of the mortals under your protection. Several guards stepped forward, unsure but obeying the council's command. Arya gasped when they moved toward Cale. Vivian instinctively stepped in front of her daughter again, her voice shaking but determined. No one touches him. The guards hesitated, unsure whose authority mattered more. Cale slowly rose to his full height. The throne hall felt smaller when he stood like that, older, dangerous. You believe you can remove me? He asked quietly. Thorn held his ground, though sweat had begun forming on his forehead. The council's authority predates your reign. Cale tilted his head slightly as if considering the argument. Yes, he said, but the council forgets something important. The runes along the walls suddenly flared brighter. The entire floor trembled beneath the noble's feet. Arya instinctively grabbed Cale's hand again, and the glowing symbols spread outward from where she stood. Gasps echoed across the hall. The castle itself was reacting to her presence. Cale's voice dropped to a whisper that still carried to the farthest wall. The castle chooses the king. The runes roared with light as if answering him. Several nobles stumbled backward. One even fell to the floor in shock. Seraphine's confident smile finally vanished. What is this? She whispered. Cale stepped down from the dais and walked toward the council slowly. This castle was built by my ancestors before your laws existed, he said, before the council rewrote history to hide their crimes. His gaze landed on Thorn. Tell them the truth. Thorn's eyes widened. I don't know what you mean. Cale's patience snapped like steel breaking. In a blur of motion, he grabbed Thorn by the collar and lifted him off the floor. Nobles screamed and scrambled away as the king held the ancient elder in the air like a rag doll. You poisoned Vivian to reach the child, Cale growled. You tried to kill the last descendant of my bloodline. The entire hall erupted in shocked whispers. Vivian stared at Thorn in disbelief. You did this, Thorn tried to speak, but Cale tightened his grip. Tell them, the king roared. The elder finally broke. Yes, he choked. Yes, we did it. The prophecy said the king's mortal bloodline would destroy the council. We had to stop it. The hall went completely silent. Confession shattered everything. Nobles looked at one another in horror. Some backed away from Seraphine and Varys as if they had suddenly become poisoned themselves. Cale released Thorn and let him collapse on the floor. You murdered the woman I loved, he said coldly. You hunted her descendants for a century, and now you dare speak of protecting the realm. Seraphine's face twisted with fury. If we hadn't acted, your bloodline would destroy everything. Cale's answer came without hesitation. Good. The word hit the hall like thunder, because everything you built deserves to fall. He turned back to the crowd of nobles, his voice rising with authority stronger than anything they had heard before. You were told mortals were weak. You were told love was dangerous. You were told fear was the only thing keeping our world stable. He gestured toward Arya and Vivian. But the bravest person in this entire kingdom is a 6-year-old girl who walked through a city full of monsters to protect her mother. The silence that followed was no longer fearful, it was thoughtful. Corvus, the oldest elder on the council who had remained silent until now, slowly stood from his seat. His ancient eyes moved from Kale to Arya to the glowing runes along the walls. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "the prophecy was misunderstood." Seraphine spun toward him in disbelief. "You can't be serious." Corvus ignored her completely. "The council was created to protect the kingdom," he continued calmly. "But protection became control, control became fear, and fear became corruption." He looked directly at Kale. "Today the castle itself has spoken. I will not challenge its choice." One by one, several nobles lowered their heads. The shift in power was immediate and undeniable. Seraphine realized she had lost. Her voice rose in furious desperation. "You fools! If you let this stand, the entire order collapses." Kale's eyes burned like crimson fire. "Exactly." Guards surrounded Seraphine, Varus, and the remaining conspirators. This time they did not hesitate. The nobles who had supported the council stepped back quickly, suddenly unwilling to share their fate. As Seraphine was dragged toward the doors, she screamed over her shoulder, "You think this is victory? The world will never accept a king ruled by human blood." Kale didn't even look at her. "Then the world will learn." The great doors slammed behind the prisoners. The throne hall finally went quiet. Slowly, Kale turned toward Arya and Vivian. The tension drained from his shoulders as if an entire century of weight had finally lifted. Arya looked up at him cautiously. "Did we win?" she asked. Kale smiled faintly, a real smile this time. "Yes," he said softly, "we did." In the months that followed, Castle Raventhorn changed in ways no one could have imagined. The council's power was reduced. Corrupt nobles were stripped of their titles, and the ancient laws banning mortal bloodlines were finally rewritten. Many vampires resisted the change at first, but the castle itself continued to respond to Arya's presence. The glowing runes became a symbol of the new era. Vivian recovered fully and eventually became the royal healer, respected for her courage and loyalty. Arya spent her days running through halls that once terrified her, often sitting beside Kale while he worked. Sometimes she would still help fold linens just like she had on the first day she walked into the fortress. The servants adored her. Even the nobles who once hated the idea of her existence slowly softened when they saw the way the king looked at the little girl like she was the most important person in the world. For Kale, the change was even deeper. After a century of ruling through distance and cold authority, he finally ruled with something else: purpose. One evening, as the sun set over the towers of Raventhorn, Kale stood on the balcony overlooking the city with Arya beside him and Vivian a few steps behind. The lights of the kingdom flickered on one by one. Arya leaned on the railing and sighed happily. "It's not scary anymore," she said. Kale looked down at her. "What is?" "The castle." She smiled up at him. "It feels like home." Kale rested a hand gently on her head, watching the city he had protected for so long. For the first time in 100 years, he understood something simple but powerful. A kingdom was not protected by laws or fear. It was protected by the people worth fighting for. Vivian joined them quietly on the balcony, her expression warm and grateful. "You changed everything," she said. Kale shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "She did." Arya looked confused. "I did," Kale nodded. "You walked into a fortress full of monsters and reminded us what being human looks like." The three of them stood together as the last light of sunset faded across the sky. And that was the day the Vampire King stopped ruling with fear and started ruling with heart. But now the question is yours. If you were Kale, would you have risked your throne and your kingdom to protect one innocent child? Tell me in the comments which side you would choose. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow I'll bring you another powerful vampire story you won't want to miss.